Hey everyone, Scott here to discuss the 2025 Wolfman movie starring Christopher Abbott, Julia Gardner, and Matilda Firth, directed by Lee Winnell. Now, after The Invisible Man, I was excited for this movie because The Invisible Man came out in January and was successful, and it was a good movie, but we'll see how this movie goes when I get to this review. Let's get into it. As a young boy in the year 1995, Blake goes hunting with his father Grady, played by Sam Yeager, in the early morning, and they see a valley with a beautiful view while he abuses him to pay attention to never eat poisonous mushrooms, as well as never go anywhere without him, as he cusses him out. And at one point, Blake sees a wolfman and hides at a place where they will be protected from the wolfman. And Blake and Grady get home as Blake goes to sleep, while Grady talks with Dan, played by the movie's director Lee Winnell, by voice, to go after the Wolfman. And this opening did have me on the edge of my seat, and I might have jumped during the sequence, and that's a good thing for a horror film. But at the same time, I don't like the father character, as he comes off pretentious as well as an asshole. As well as we never see Lee Winnell as Dan, but we hear him on the radio. But overall, the first 10 minutes was sort of good. I'll give the movie that. 30 years later, Blake as an adult, played by Christopher Abbott, whom I just reviewed in that god-awful film Craven the Hunter, is a father himself to a little girl named Ginger, played by Matilda Firth, as she goes off without her father in the middle of the sidewalk, and a homeless man, I'm guessing is who it is, don't shop without the motherfucking leash. Blake yells at her and cusses at her like his father did, but he apologizes at the end as they get home, and Blake hears about his father being deceased, while his wife Charlotte, played by Julia Gardner, whom I'm going to review in the upcoming Fantastic Four movie, as she was terrible in the she was in a terrible film based on a prequel to Rosemary's Baby called Apartment 7A, on an important phone call, and Blake tells Charlotte and Ginger about his father being deceased, and he comes by to visit her for lunch, and the next day comes as he confesses they're not doing well at the moment and wants to go where he grew up in Oregon, and packs up things as he wants to show them the valley and he saw as a kid. And I don't get these characters, as they have no arcs, and at this point I don't like them for that reason. And so far the acting in this is pretty bad. They go to Oregon and almost arrive, but made a wrong turn and luckily encountered Derek, played by Benedict Hardy, whom I just reviewed in Mel Gibson's Hacksaw Ridge, and have reviewed him before in another Lee Winnell movie directed, The Invisible Man, the one I just brought out from 2020, who shows them where to go for Grady's farmhouse. And they get closer to the house and see a man in the middle of the road and crashes a truck they're renting in between two trees, as Ginger and Charlotte get out and sits on top of the truck, and as does Derek, but unfortunately he gets killed by the Wolfman, and Blake gets scratched by the Wolfman. And most of the movie is not very scary, and we barely see what the Wolfman looked like until we get near the end of the movie. And that hell, even the trailers didn't show it to you. Like, and Nosferatu pulled that off. The recent one pulled that off much better than this movie did, as the shots made this movie look ugly. Blake, Charlotte, and Ginger run to the house as they get there, and Blake finds a place where they can turn on the lights as well as the power of the house. And Blake looks outside for the Wolfman while putting Ginger to sleep, while she asks if Derek is dead, and he asks most likely, as his job is to protect Ginger, and will never forgive himself for scarring her, as he already did witnessing Derek's death, as he loves his little girl, and he tells her to go to sleep after talking with Charlotte. What the fuck is that thing? And pulls a cabinet away from the door, and they put it there after they arrived. And the dialogue in this is corny for damn sure, as the writing in this is terrible. Blake smells something awful, while Charlotte tests the radio and to get a hold of anyone and eats a piece of his father's jerky, as it tastes horrible, and loses a tooth, like somehow he's becoming the fucking Wolfman. And Charlotte ties up Blake's wound, and she continues to test the radio, while Ginger awakens, doesn't listen to her father, while he's making so much fucking noises. And Ginger has this obnoxious habit of not listening to her father, And she gets on my nerves. And she got on my nerves at that point, as Blake puts a piece of wood up, and this doesn't feel good while doing so, as he gets to the sink to vomit, as he hears noises coming from the roof. And honestly, I thought the Wolfman was going to come bursting out of a closet somewhere, but as it turns out, Blake heard a spider as he wakes up. And I'll give credit for wakes up Charlotte. Well, actually, let's move on. But I do like that sound editing in that scene, as that was actually pretty good. And he wakes up Charlotte, and she hears the Wolfman, and Blake covers the back door until the Wolfman's arm comes in and scratches Blake's leg, which was a tad frightening, but unfortunately it didn't scare me. Blake slowly changes into the Wolfman as he's slowly becoming menacing and scares the hell out of Charlotte, as he can't understand what she's saying, while Charlotte calls for help on the radio because she's worried for her husband, as he leaks himself, while Ginger is also worried about Blake, and Charlotte comes in with a marker and paper and writing dying, as she believes he's sick, and she says she can't live without Blake, as she brings up how he hears he's her soulmate. And we get Blake's point of view of how he can't understand a damn thing she's saying, and starts to bleed. And the effects in this movie is so, with an exception of the sound effects, is pretty good, but the rest of them pretty damn poor. And the way the story is executed is kind of better than the last time, whereas last time it felt like they missed the boat of making a great movie. But on the cast they had, but here is a little better, but not by far much, where we have people coming up with things they'll be famous for eventually. Blake bites the hell out of his arm and acts like a wolfman as Charlotte tries to get Blake and Ginger into the truck, as she tries to start it with a car power box, and eventually gets it started, and she takes it off and goes back in the car and sees the Wolfman after clearing the window from dust, and they climb up a place where the Wolfman can't get them, while we can barely see the Wolfman, and while they as they pass by, the Wolfman tries to get them, but Blake makes the Wolfman go after him, while to keep Charlotte and Ginger safe, so that they can go back to the house. And the score in that scene was awful. Just awful. Charlotte lets Blake in as he vomits blood as well as the finger from the Wolfman, and he gets closer while scaring Charlotte, and he becomes the Wolfman and opens the door and suddenly gets into a fight with the Wolfman as a Wolfman himself. And I sort of enjoyed the sound effects in that fight scene, and I'll give it this. It's a cool fight scene, as he does win and change into the Wolfman, while Charlotte sees a tattoo that belonged to Grady. As I don't know if he ever described it to her, honestly, Blake, and recognizes that it was his father, and tells Ginger Grady got sick like Blake, and Grady gave it to Blake as the power goes off, and they get scared of Blake. And this isn't the worst in the Wolfman series thus far, as it is so far belonging to She-Wolf of London or the 2010 Wolfman movie, but it still is pretty bad. Blake, as a Wolfman, comes up to Charlotte and Ginger, and they hide from him in the room, and the radio in the room, while Charlotte and Ginger can't see Blake, but Blake can see them, which was a good POV moment, but the effects in that scene was pretty bad. And Blake gets stuck on a bear trap and tries to get out of it. Blake bites his way out, and I was reminded of another movie, of a movie Lee Winnell wrote, Saw, the first one, where Lawrence saws off his own foot, while Charlotte and Ginger escape to a place the truck got stuck on the trees. And by the truck, I'm talking about the moving truck, not the truck that they were trying to leave earlier. But as they go to that area where they were crashed at earlier in the film, and Charlotte picks up the hunter's gun that Derek had before he died, and hide to a place in the trees where Blake was hiding with his father in the beginning of the movie. As Blake gets up there as a Wolfman, and Charlotte ends up shooting him dead, while his eyes look pretty damn creepy, and they're sad about it, which, who cares? And they end up going to the valley Blake wanted to show them in the beginning of the movie, and despite I liked a few things in this movie, the climax made this movie bad. But how bad? Let's talk about it in the rating. I'll give this movie a 3.8 out of 10. It did scare me a couple of times, and it's always good to get me scared in a horror film, but at the end of it, the scares felt cheap. As the first 10 minutes of this movie was good, while I don't like the characters as they have no arcs, and the acting in this is pretty bad. The shots made this movie look ugly. That hell, even Nosferatu, the one I reviewed recently, looks better than this, as the dialogue is corny for damn sure. And the writing in this is terrible. And unlike the 2024 Nosferatu movie, this movie doesn't scare me too much. And the effects in this movie are pretty damn poor, except for maybe the sound effects with the spider. And the story here was executed a little better than last time, whereas last time it felt like they missed the boat on making a great movie with the cast they had. Whereas here, they have a pretty unknown cast with things coming up in their future that'll make them famous eventually. This is the biggest disappointment of Lee Winnell after he came off successful from The Invisible Man from 2020 and creates a terrible film out of the Universal Monster movies, which felt like a shame big time. And I don't want to not recommend this to people because it has potential, but at the end of the day, I can't recommend this to people. So unfortunately, I don't have a choice but to give it a non-recommendation for this movie. Despite I enjoyed the sound effects, but at the end of the day, this movie was pretty bad, and I feel sad about that this movie had potential, but I can't recommend it to people. I just can't do it. So I'd like to thank you guys for joining me for this Wolfman retrospective. And until we get to, I don't know, maybe Frankenstein? Ooh.